a series of seminars. I feel pretty privileged that we have the opportunity to have a seminar at the College of Technology, and certainly the first one. My name is Lynn Stocking, and I'm the Associate Dean at the College of Technology. And let me say this first so that we make sure we get it in. If you are interested in receiving information with regard to the seminar series or newsletter on the Practical Ethics Center, there is, at the back of the room, on the last table, a mailing list. So please, make sure you put your name and address and contact information on that particular sign-up sheet. And as we go forward this afternoon, nice to see you all here. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us this afternoon and at noon. Now, it is my pleasure, and I feel again a privilege, to be able to introduce to you our speaker or presenter for today, Mark Hansen. Mark is the Interim Director for the Practical Ethics Center, at the University of Montana. And he is also a faculty affiliate for the Philosophy Department at the U of M. He holds a doctorate in Ethics and Religious Studies from the University of Virginia, is a graduate of St. Olaf College and Yale Divinity School. Prior to moving to Montana, Dr. Hansen was an Associate for Ethics and Society at the Hastings Center. And at the Hastings Center, let me stumble all the way through that, which is a bioethics research institute in New York. He directed that particular center's research program on values and biotechnology. He continues today not only to lead well in the Practical Ethics Center, but to conduct research and write, and as you will see today, present to us. Please welcome Dr. Hansen.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm happy to see such a great turnout. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'm just wondering, by show of hands, how many people made the trip over from the main campus to be with us? Man, great. Thanks. So today I want to talk to you about the ethics and politics of stem cell research. And the issue of stem cell research has been an ethical issue and a political issue since embryonic stem cells were first isolated in 1998. The ethical issues stem from the fact that embryonic stem cells, which is one form of stem cell, come from embryos, obviously, and anything that involves manipulation of the embryo, and in this case, extraction of cells, which kills the embryo, is going to be a political hot topic as well as an ethical issue. But just to show you how powerful of a political issue it was, I found it remarkable that something that seems as obscure as a cell, a type of cell, actually warranted a primetime address to the nation by the President of the United States. And that's indeed what happened on August 9th, 2001, when President Bush gave an address to give his position on stem cell research, one which gave qualified limited support, federal funding for stem cell lines that were already existing, but not for the creation of new stem cell lines. I'll come back to that in a bit after I've discussed a little bit more about what stem cells are, so we have a bit of a background. But it was interesting to note that in a poll that was taken immediately after the President's address, we found that 75% of the American people thought that stem cell research was necessary. But there were 49%, almost half, thought that there was something morally wrong with stem cell research, which means that of that pool, you had 25% at least that thought that this was wrong but necessary. And I think that goes to highlight the ways in which this is an issue which involves balancing of principles that we think to be, on the one hand, involve some moral wrong, but also some moral good. And I'll be talking about that in a second. The issue also became politicized more when Ron Reagan brought this issue to a primetime address to the Democratic National Convention this year. He stated that it was not his intention that stem cell research be a political issue, a rather odd thing to say given the platform he was speaking on. But I think I would challenge us to consider today that not only do we have ethical issues to consider with stem cell research, but this is quite properly a political issue. A political issue because it involves particular kinds of questions that we're going to have to solve together somehow. Okay, a little bit of background first so we can clarify what it is we're talking about. What are stem cells? Well, stem cells are a unique type of cell in that they are the precursor cells, so to speak, for the differentiated types of cells that we have in our bodies. In other words, they're the cells which give rise to different kinds of cells we have in our bodies. And they come in a variety of types. And I'll just throw this up here for you to follow a little bit better. The first cell type that we hear about sometimes are what are called adult stem cells. And adult stem cells are those cells which are within our bodies and which give rise to certain types of cells, but they're more limited. At least the science is telling us primarily that certain types of cells, for instance, in our body, create blood cells and different types of blood products. Other types of stem cells give rise to different types of cells within the body. And so they're considered to be potentially scientifically useful and therapeutically useful, but also more limited in that, unlike the other types of stem cells, they may not have as wide a range of therapeutic purposes. A second type of cell that you don't hear as much about are what are called embryonic germ cells. Germ cells are also, they're a type of stem cell that within about 4-week-old pre-embryos eventually give rise to the gametes, in other words, the germ cells within human beings. But they also, prior to becoming sperm and egg, have unique properties of being differentiated into potentially different types of cells. And so they've also attracted some attention, but not nearly the attention that we're seeing to embryonic stem cells. Umbilical cord blood cells are also being raised as recognized as having some value in terms of the family of stem cells. And one company at least has decided to bet its investment dollars on pursuing this line, a company called Anthrogenesis. But there still remains a great deal to be seen about the potential there. The type of stem cell that's receiving the most amount of attention and controversy, and the one that was spoken about exclusively by Ron Reagan at the convention, is the embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are cells which are taken from the inner cell mass of a blastocyst at probably about 6 to 7 days after of cell division, so very early on. They have a couple of unique properties. One, they're considered to be immortal in the sense that until they become directed to differentiate to a particular kind of cell, they will reproduce indefinitely. Secondly, as undifferentiated pluripotent cells, that means they have the potential to develop to almost every other kind of cell in our body. And so the idea is that if scientists can direct the differentiation of those cells to become particular kinds of tissue, like muscle, blood, skeleton, neural cells, whatever you need, then you can actually grow tissues and potentially even organs from these types of cells. And so that's the kind of scientific potential that they have. And here's just a graphic that shows the process. Again, what you see, of course, in the top figure are stages of development of the human embryo, very roughly depicted. And at the bottom there, you can see that 6 to 7 days, you extract from the inner cell mass these embryonic stem cells. They're cultured, and the hope is then to direct them into specific cell and tissue types. Now, where do we get the embryos that are the sources of the embryonic stem cells? Well, there are three major sources currently. The first one would be surplus embryos from in vitro fertilization techniques from fertility clinics. These are embryos that were created originally for reproductive techniques for the purposes of reproduction, but are left over. In other words, they weren't needed in the reproduction process. They're stored, essentially frozen, and left in storage devices in fertility clinics around the country. And there are estimates that there are at least well over 100,000 fertilized embryos in storage right now that could potentially be used. A second source would be to use in vitro fertilization techniques, in other words, joining sperm and egg in the petri dish, to create the embryo specifically for the purposes of obtaining stem cells. And finally, using cloning techniques. SCNT stands for somatic cell nuclear transfer. That's the type of cloning technique that's controversial. And that, just show you a graphic on how that works for those of you who are interested. Taking an enucleated egg and a cell from a human body, you could take a cell from somebody who needed organs or an organ or tissues, take a cell from their body, extract a nucleus, place it in an enucleated egg, that's the somatic cell nuclear transfer, and then through the techniques of cloning, force that egg to start behaving as an embryo. And then you extract the stem cells from that embryo and continue with differentiating them into the types of tissues and cells that the person would need. The advantage of this type of technique, and why people are most excited about this source of stem cells more than any other, is that it essentially creates cells and tissues that would be genetically compatible with a person who needs them, because they were created originally from the cells taken from that person's own body. So, when Ron Reagan talked about each of us having our own sort of personal tissue factories that could provide the therapeutic sources that we need, that's what he was talking about. That was what he was focusing on exclusively. Okay, now why do we want these kind of stem cells? Well, a couple different reasons. The main ethical principle that would justify using stem cells is that relief of suffering. There's tremendous potential for using stem cells to treat such diseases as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, diabetes, and also injuries like spinal cord injuries, because treatment of those types of conditions require new tissues that behave in a healthy manner as opposed to a pathological manner. So the idea that one could derive cells, which then would be healthy, that could be transplanted to the patient and provide a therapeutic benefit, is why people are so motivated and excited about this technology. Another principle that gets invoked on behalf of why one should go ahead with stem cell research, is a freedom of scientific inquiry. Of course, the scientific community, in addition to biotechnology companies, are of course nervous and often sensitive to governmental regulation and particularly any limitations on the kind of work that they're doing. They want to be able to be free to be able to pursue the research and see what types of benefits that it may have. Okay, so tremendous benefit potential. It's important to stress that nothing therapeutic has actually been produced from embryonic stem cells, because the science is not far enough along yet where they're able to really control the differentiation process predictably and to turn these into therapies. And so the research has a long way to go, as excited as people are about these kinds of techniques. Well, so what are the ethical issues? When we're talking about adult stem cell usage, it seems to be fairly unproblematic in that we're talking about deriving cells from human beings currently alive. And so you want to pay attention, of course, to the usual ethical concerns one has in dealing with adult human beings, having to do with informed consent and no unjustified harm and following certain research protocols and so on. With embryonic germ cells, and I'll just mention that here, again, you have the ethical issues that are going to be raised by deriving cells from essentially fetal tissue. There are some protocols that the government has established that try to separate the ethics of an abortion decision, should you be deriving it from something that was aborted, or the decision to actually terminate the fetus, or the embryo in this case, from the use of that tissue. It's a complicated ethical question. Embryonic germ cells have not received a lot of ethical attention, and so I'm going to focus primarily here, again, on embryonic stem cells. And with embryonic stem cells, you can categorize the ethical issues in three broad categories. Now, the first one I've stated as moral status of the embryo, because, as I've not yet, I don't believe, stated, deriving the stem cell or extracting the stem cell from the embryo kills the embryo. And so we have an issue of intentional destruction of a human embryo. This raises a question which has been a source of ongoing controversy, certainly within the abortion debate, and this is where the two issues overlap. And so, how do we consider what moral obligations do we have to a 6 to 7 day old pre-embryo? Well, if you consider that cell mass at 6 to 7 days to be essentially the equivalent of mere tissue, it hasn't differentiated into anything that has any feelings, sentience, nervous system, and so on. If it's mere tissue, then there's no ethical problem, because what you just have is a source of biological material that could be therapeutically useful. If you find that this is equivalent to an adult human being, like any of us morally, then, of course, you can only kill it based on the same sorts of reasons that you would justify killing anybody here in this room. And that is, it usually takes a pretty good reason, something like self-defense. So, if you consider this 6 to 7 day old organism to be something that is not morally empty, but has some status, but not the same status as those of us sitting here, then you're in that difficult area of trying to decide what is it, what do we owe this organism ethically, how much protection does it deserve, and how should we treat it. So this is the type of troubled middle that I think most people have occupied in the abortion debate, and probably occupy also here in this particular issue. So the status of the embryo. The reason why we might consider this in terms of political as well as ethical terms has to do with the fact that this is not an issue that we've been able to solve ethically. It's what philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre called an intractable issue, in that there doesn't seem to be any rational way in which we could all sit down in a room and come to an agreement on what degree of respect is owed the embryo at this point. So that's an issue that somehow the stem cell question has put front and center again for our society to have to wrestle with and to come to some kind of a conclusion about. Okay, the second area I've identified here is embryo research funding. Why is that an ethical issue? Well, it's ethical in the sense of public tax dollars and resources being used to support efforts that some would consider of great moral significance. To what extent should public dollars be used in the destruction of embryos? Well, currently embryo research is very restricted. Within the private sector, companies can do whatever they want. Venture capitalists can invest in biotech companies and experiment at least in most states, not all, to their heart's delight on the human embryo, including cloning the human embryo if they so desire. But anything that's federally funded currently has a great deal of restriction upon it. And so we're beginning to see states take a lot of different initiatives on this now. Some states have outlawed embryo research, anything that results in the destruction of an embryo. On the other hand, front page of the New York Times today was about a $3 billion ballot initiative to commit state funding to stem cell research. And you have a number of notable celebrities and interested citizens, as well as disease advocacy groups, committing a great deal of money to support this. I think it's interesting, $15 million has been used to support the political campaign on behalf of this initiative alone, which is interesting to compare that amount of money to the $25 million that the federal government spends in total on this. So this November, California is going to be deciding whether, as one state, it's going to spend $300 million a year on stem cell research, relative to the $25 million a year that the Bush administration has committed of the total of federal dollars. Okay, so there's a lot of state activity on this. New Jersey has also authorized state funds for this, but also criminalized reproductive cloning to make sure that cloning techniques stay limited to stem cell research and not to reproduction. And this is one of the dividing line issues that's been problematic. Okay, the third area identified as the sources of embryos. I've talked about how there are, in fact, 3 different sources of embryos, major sources. And so, as I mentioned, adult stem cells seem to be relatively unproblematic. When we're talking about the other sources, however, use of in vitro fertilization embryos for reproduction, the National Bioethics Advisory Committee under President Clinton basically concluded that that was preferable ethically to those embryos that were created for research. Why? Because of the intention. That if one is creating an embryo with the intention that it be used for reproduction, and then later it's not needed for reproduction, and those embryos are going to be destroyed anyway, that's considered to be, at least this committee found, ethically preferable to the intention of creating them merely for the use of deriving stem cells resulting in their death. So President Bush himself made the statement, it's morally wrong to create life in order to destroy it. He's really talking about that direct intention that one has of creating something knowing that you're going to destroy it as opposed to creating it. At least the decision is based on intention for reproduction, because we think that's what embryos are for anyway. Yeah, a question?
But for in vitro fertilization, how do you know it's going to be destroyed? Because somebody could come along later and still want that embryo.
Well, this is true. The question was about how do you know whether it's going to be destroyed. The disposition of embryos is not very well regulated in the country, and mostly it is a decision that is going to be authorized by the people who produced the embryo, the parents, in other words. And they have ultimate authority over disposing the embryo. It would be a requirement, I'm guessing ethically, that they give informed consent for that embryo to be donated for research purposes. There are many that have just been sitting for a long time in freezers, and their viability, I think, would be questionable, certainly for reproductive purposes, if not for stem cells. But it does involve a decision, again, by a private party, just like use of aborted fetal tissue, that one would have to, well, the question would be whether their moral decision by the private couple to donate it would draw a sharp enough ethical line between what they want to do and the ethics of that and the use of public funds to say, okay, if all you're going to do is essentially throw this away, then there's something else that could be done with it. They're obviously with the population of embryos in the 6 figures, and I've even seen estimates as high as 400,000. There doesn't seem to be at least a great deal of desire or interest in donating these for adoption. I'm not sure what the reasons for that are, but it's a good question. Okay, so just to finish this out on the sources, so we have this relative potential ethical preferability of IVF embryos for reproduction versus research. And again, that's arguable. Some people don't agree that that's a distinction. But there's also then the ethical question of cloning. And I've talked about the benefit of using cloning techniques to develop that embryo just because, again, it would seem those embryonic stem cells have the greatest potential therapeutic value, and cloning as a source of them seems to provide the best possibility for the best therapeutic treatment and outcome. Now, many people, of course, if you're cloning, you're also creating an embryo just for research purposes. So you have that problem of what your intention is and how you're treating the embryo. But in addition, people worry about the line between therapeutic cloning, which is what we're talking about here, and reproductive cloning. In other words, when scientists begin to perfect human cloning techniques for the purposes of deriving stem cells, those are the same techniques that are going to be involved in creating cloned embryos for the purposes of reproduction. And some people worry that this is a genie that we can't keep in the bottle. In other words, that perfection of therapeutic cloning under the guise of secrecy of biotech companies, arrangements with private citizens, and the privacy of the doctor-patient relationship, people will start using cloned embryos and the techniques of cloning to develop human cloning for reproduction. Some people worry about that, obviously, more than others, and whether one can draw a strict legal line or moral line between those two, I think, remains to be seen. There are also a couple other related issues in terms of cloning for stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are also relatively a little bit easier to manipulate genetically, which means that the possibility of also combining this technique with genetic engineering, manipulation of the chromosomes' genetic material, and then using stem cells for reproductive purposes with an engineered human being is also something which is on some people's horizon at this particular point, even though it's, again, it's a ways off in terms of what would be actually possible. So, what are the kinds of ethical judgments we're talking about then? It seems that, given the fact that for most people, or at least for those who find the status of the embryo question to be a real question, the nature of ethical reasoning, of course, is that you try to minimize your ethical compromises. Even if you feel ultimately justified in using embryos for research, that it may be that what you want to do is to use them in a way which minimizes the ethical compromises involved. And that might be certainly taking advantage of current cell lines that have already been established and are available. At the time of President Bush's announcement, there were 78 cell lines currently available, most of them outside of the United States. And that research is being pursued aggressively outside of the United States. So current cell lines, adult stem cells, most people opposed to embryonic stem cell research are pushing the adult stem cell research quite aggressively. Also, looking at how one can alleviate the need for stem cells, finding other treatments and prevention for the kinds of things that we're looking for. Using animal studies, also the possibility of creating non-viable embryos. Could we derive stem cells from embryos that are not viable or engineered, created somehow so that they wouldn't have the potential to become human beings? Therefore, what you're destroying is not something that's a typical human embryo, but something different. That is another way that's been at least suggested as a way to minimize the moral cost. Also, again, trying to find the balance amongst the sources in terms of which are going to be the best ones, and perhaps looking at the least problematic sources first before moving on to the moral problem, the ones that are more morally problematic. So I think the next two questions really characterize the way that this debate tends to break down for people. And this was a characterization that the President's Council on Bioethics, which is headed by Leon Kast from the University of Chicago, I owe this characterization to him. He says, essentially, the nature of the matter, ethically, comes down in two forms. One form are those who say this is a matter of inviolable principles. The principle is that that there ought to be certain moral boundaries on our research, and one of those boundaries is that we don't destroy human embryos as a part of research. It doesn't matter what the potential benefits might be, or how scientifically valuable or therapeutically useful it may be. This is an inviolable principle. And within research, we have principles like informed consent and other moral safeguards that we use to limit what research is going to be about. The ends do not justify the means here, and so we have an inviolable principle that needs to hold. The others, another sort of way of characterizing the debate is one of moral balancing. It's saying that what we have here is an imperfect moral calculus of balancing conflicting principles. Our obligation to relieve suffering and the tremendous amount of relief of suffering that could be gotten from these stem cells versus the morally problematic step of destroying certain embryos in the process. And even risking potential other implications such as developing of cloning techniques and so on. And so the question that those who are in this sort of a couple of metaphors here, it's like a sliding scale. When the benefits seem to be so great, the potential consequences, or when we seem to have when the moral justification reaches a point where it tips the argument in favor of going ahead and violating otherwise presumptions against destroying embryos, then the decision would be justified. But where is the tipping point? And who is to make the decision about what kind of where that tipping point is? Well, if we look for a moment at what our current policy is, this was the decision basically that President Bush issued in August of 2001, and it is the policy that remains to this day. Federal funding is allowed for research on existing cell lines. And as I said, that's about 78, most of which are in Sweden, the United Kingdom, India, and Australia. The others being in a couple locations in the United States. Yeah?
What's considered a cell line?
A cell line is when the stem cell is harvested and then cultured. As I said, it continually reproduces, and so you develop basically a group of cells that have developed from one initial genetic source. And so those cell lines are there, but the genetic sources are limited. Another problem is that the universities and scientific companies that have partnered on this, and this is biotech companies and universities, have also taken out patents on the lines and the techniques, which limits the access to them from other companies. So we have, by limiting it on existing cell lines, what President Bush was saying is he didn't want any federal dollars used or implicated in anything that involves the active destruction of the embryo. When he made his announcements, those embryos had already been destroyed. The derivation had already been initiated, and there was no possibility of those embryos being viable anymore. So we drew the moral boundary line in saying we shouldn't use public funds for that. But since they're already available, and the immoral deed has already been done, then federal funds could be used to continue research on those cell lines. He also wanted them to be derived from embryos created for reproductive purposes. So for the president, it was important that it be for reproduction, not just for research. That embryo is no longer needed for reproduction. They wanted to have informed consent of those embryos being donated, and to be sure that there were no financial inducements. In other words, people weren't paid to give up those embryos. So I think that, you know, the fact those were already available, but that's a good list that also, I think, signals what some of the moral issues and concerns are currently. Well, so just to kind of turn this over to some of your questions and discussions then, I think you'll have to, in terms of thinking this for yourself, first of all, ponder it in the framework of the whether or not we think we do have an inviolable principle, or whether we do have a moral balancing act. And we might pose these types of questions. Some people have said, I mean, how do we characterize the nature of this question? Is it properly a political issue? It certainly is an ethical one. It also is, for many people, a theological or a religious question. That the status of the human embryo is something which people answer that question by appealing to their religious authorities and religious traditions. Or is it just ultimately a scientific question? I think certainly I would argue that the first three obtain, and that it's not merely a scientific question. Is the president's position ultimately a religious position and therefore should remain out of the political realm? Some people, it was Ron Reagan in his speech at the Democratic National Convention said, we should not allow the theological convictions of a minority to overrule the majority preferences of the American people. Is this merely a religious minority imposing on the majority will of the people? And is that, and if so, is that proper? Is this a matter of inviolable principle or moral balancing? How should we respond to the issue of public funding for something that a minority finds to be a significant moral offense? And perhaps other questions that you may have in this regard. So, let me see. So I think what I'll do is now that I've laid out the issues, I'll throw it open to see how some of you might answer some of these questions, or questions that you may have for me. Anybody? Yes, Mel.
Mark, what's the current status of the viability of those 78 cell lines? I mean, I understand that a lot of them aren't very effective. How many of them are being used by people who want to do the research outside of the people who originated them? So, in effect, are there like 10 available cell lines, or is it more like 30?
Yeah. The question was about the viability of the existing lines and their availability to people who want to work on it. I don't have a conclusive scientific answer on the viability question. I have heard, however, that they're becoming decreasingly, that their usefulness is decreasing with time. And so that the amount of material, just the number of cells available for research in terms of viable cells, is actually does not meet the demand. I don't know what, I couldn't give you a number in terms of a percentage of those 78 being viable, but at least, and it's difficult to get good information on this, in part because a lot of it is happening outside the United States, and companies are also, they have an interest, the scientific community has an interest certainly in claiming that they don't have what they need, because they're politically and scientifically and economically motivated to try and get more cell lines and to try and open up the technique. So I can't say with confidence, although what I have seen is that I've seen expressions of concern that the viability isn't as useful as it might be. Availability is limited because it's biotech company Geron has a contractual agreement with the University of Wisconsin, sort of one of two places in the United States where the bulk of this work is going on. And because of the intellectual property arrangements and patents that are currently, that they've established over their work, anybody else who wants to do work with those cell lines has to pay fees. And I don't know, how restrictive they're being in terms of that, but obviously they've got an interest in not allowing their competition to get too far along either. So I think there are some restrictions that are important, and which is why a lot of people are calling for additional federal funding. So the degree to which the additional federal funding will help, it's hard to say, but it certainly is being used to actually train people to do work in this area, but then getting access to viable stem cell lines that they can do something with is an obstacle. Yeah.
Is this ethical debate something that's going on primarily only in the United States, or does it happen in all the countries that are involved in stem cells? And as big a deal like in Holland and the United Kingdom?
It has been, the question about is whether, excuse me, it's been debated in the other countries as well. Excuse me. It certainly has been debated in other countries, and they've had, I know the United Kingdom has groups that work specifically like a President's Council on Bioethics to make recommendations to the government about stem cell research. But it is safe to say that the so-called, that the contingency of those who are politically active and vocal on behalf of protecting embryos is not nearly as strong in those countries as it is in the United States. And so the extent of the vocal opposition and certainly the more conservative nature of the laws is much greater in the United States. And so that's in parts what's fueled the debate, is the fact that those who were part of the Right to Life groups in the United States, from an already well-formed coalition through the abortion debate, are also actively opposing stem cell research on this question. And so that's what's made it politically more difficult. And of course, the federal regulations are going to depend on who has political power in this country. And obviously, John Kerry is tried to make it well known that he would liberalize regulations in this regard. And President Bush, who comes from a more evangelical Christian background, will tend to side with the minority of folks in this country who are opposed to it. By the way, I failed to put this slide up. This was a slide about about public opinion from August 2001 and August 2004. You can see, I mean, the first Gallup poll, of course, that was a poll that was taken right after the president's announcement. And there was a sizable portion of the United States population that didn't even know what a stem cell was. So it's one of those things where you're getting more of an initial, less informed reaction than you are now. It's also interesting to note, there is a, see, I looked at a couple of different polls. One was an ABC News poll, and one was a Harris poll. They were roughly similar. But I think one thing that's interesting to note, the Roman Catholic position is one in which life begins at conception, and the full moral respect is owed to that being from the moment of conception. Yet looking at how religious traditions break down on this issue, according to a 2004 ABC News poll, there was a 2/3, 65% of Roman Catholics supported embryonic stem cell research. And among evangelical white Protestants, it was about 50-50. So And it's also interesting to note folks like Nancy Reagan and some prominent Republicans coming out in favor of stem cell research and asking, it's interesting to ask the question, why are they making exceptions in their moral principles for embryonic stem cells but not for certain justified abortions? It's just I think an interesting sociological as well as ethical question that traditions which ought to be the most conservative are also finding half to a majority of their religious members supporting it. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
I heard a presentation from a doctor on TV, and he brought up the point that adult stem cell research has been successful, whereas embryonic stem cell research has not. So why aren't a lot of the dollars going into adult stem cell research when it's been successful, and instead of creating life and then killing it and making a moral issue out of something that isn't successful?
Right. Right. So the question was about reported successes in adult stem cells and lack of success in embryonic stem cells. There was in some of the literature I've seen about this, there are scientific studies that have shown certainly greater potential in adult stem cells for use in developing cells and tissues outside of the sort of the expected tissues you could produce. In other words, taking stem cells that would normally produce blood products and being able to direct them to actually produce other types of tissues than one would normally expect. And that's created some optimism about the use of adult stem cells. What basically what I've seen, and again, it's a little bit always hard to tell sort of where people have political interests involved. Those studies on the success of adult stem cells, at least people have had difficulty reproducing them, as well as there's some question about the techniques were involved and whether there were other types of cells that were somehow, implicated in the success of those. And so there really is all I can say is there are those within the scientific community that see much greater potential in adult stem cells than other people. And so the potential for them, I would say, is disputed. Certainly there are successes for adult stem cells for certain types of treatments. Embryonic stem cells, I think the reason why there might be some resistance to accepting adult stem cells is just the fact that a lot of scientists believe that ultimately they're going to be better therapeutic sources for what people need. But again, it's, when you get into an issue that's politically and ethically charged, as well as where scientists and companies speaking out about this have economic and scientific stake in what they're pulling for, one is always tempted to think a bit, or to look at those arguments with a bit of a grain of salt. Other questions or thoughts about this? Yeah.
Where's the basis for the moral judgment that the president made that the embryos should only be created with reproductive purposes in mind, not basically saying he was against just producing embryos for the sake of research?
Right.
Where's that basis come from?
Well, the question was about the point in the policy that what you're referring to here, I take it, would be this point, derived from embryos created for reproductive purposes. So what was the basis for President Bush insisting on that particular point? And again, I think, in looking at what you have here, it seems to be that what he was looking for was a way to show some federal support for something that people are excited about, but do it in a way that was as ethically distinct from anything that's problematic as it could be. So certainly by not having funds involved in anything that destroyed the embryo, that's one line that he was creating that keeps federal funds from being used for that. But then he also wanted the embryos to have been originally created for reproductive purposes. And to be honest, I think that once you've already distinguished that your federal funds are not going to the destruction of the embryo, what happened prior to that almost doesn't seem to matter in terms of, all you have is federal funds going toward research on available embryos that had already been destroyed. So what difference does it make where they came from? I think, again, by insisting on informed consent, no financial inducements, created for reproductive purposes, he's saying that not only have they already been destroyed, but prior to their destruction, they were created with the intention by which one, would expect to create embryos, and that's for reproduction. And in other words, if the intention makes a moral difference, that creating them for research versus creating them for reproduction, then it would be better to pick them for those that came from reproduction. In other words, even though the embryo is already destroyed, he would want it to come from a source that in itself was still not morally problematic. If it were created for research, if there were financial inducements, if there were no informed consent, then the source of those embryos would be, there would be additional ethical taints to how the embryos were obtained. But whether that ultimately makes a difference ethically, I think is debatable. I mean, it's a question of distinguishing. It seems to me the ultimate purpose is to have federal funds not go for destruction of embryos. And in that case, where they came from before that is not an issue that's implicated in the use of federal funds. But I think he's just trying to say, let's have this as ethical a process as possible. Yeah.
How far behind would you say the American stem cell research is against its Eastern and Western European counterparts? Because I know that they are making strides where we're stuck.
Yeah, the distance between what's happening here. I mean, again, I don't have enough details in terms of actual developments to say, to give any sort of concrete examples. Certainly the American companies and firms are arguing that they're behind. And the reason, and I think there has been more success. There's just been a lot, the amount of research going on and the amount of investment in it has allowed the Europeans and the Indians and Australians to accomplish more, but it hasn't yet really been demonstrated in terms of beneficial results. The Europeans don't have therapies, for example, and so on. So one company in the United States has used cloning techniques. They only got it so far, but basically there isn't a significant obvious difference, but the Americans would claim that in terms of the science behind it, that they're falling behind. I guess we've reached the 1 o'clock period, so I just want to thank you all for your attention.